The telegram arrived in Alina Hatcher's parlor on a frigid March morning in 1875, containing only 5 words. Send her back. Too stubborn. Victoria Hampton stared at the crumpled yellow paper in her trembling hands, the reality of her situation settling over her like a heavy blanket. She had traveled nearly 2,000 miles from Boston to Wyoming Territory, endured a week-long journey by train and stagecoach, only to be rejected by her intended husband after just 3 days. "What will you do now, dear?" Alina asked, her voice tinged with genuine concern. As the operator of one of the most reputable bride agencies in the West, she had never encountered such a situation. Victoria smoothed her skirts and lifted her chin. "I suppose I shall find employment and make my own way." Alina shook her head. "Jobs for unmarried women are scarce in Sweetwater. And with winter setting in." She let the implication hang in the air between them. "I will not return to Boston as a failure," Victoria insisted, her green eyes flashing with determination. At 22, she had left behind a life of genteel poverty, her parents' recent deaths having left her with few prospects beyond working as a governess or companion. There must be other men seeking wives. "Well," Alina hesitated, rifling through the papers on her desk. "There is one. Though I hesitate to suggest it. Please, Mrs. Hatcher, I have nowhere else to go." Alina sighed and pulled out a weathered letter. "Francis O'Rourke. He owns a cattle ranch about 30 miles outside of town. Rough sort, but honest from what I hear. Lost his wife 5 years ago and hasn't remarried." Victoria took the letter, studying the bold, slanting handwriting. The man's requirements were simple. A woman of good health who could cook, keep house, and wasn't afraid of hard work. No mention of beauty, temperament, or breeding. "He's been on my list for nearly a year," Alina continued. "I've hesitated to match him because his ranch is so remote and he's developed something of a reputation." "What sort of reputation?" "They call him the Wolf of Willow Creek, keeps to himself, rarely comes to town. Some say he's half wild himself." Alina shook her head. "I couldn't possibly send you there, dear." Victoria refolded the letter carefully. "Did Mr. Sullivan specify why he found me too stubborn?" Alina's cheeks reddened slightly. "He mentioned you questioned his methods of running his household and refused to defer to his judgment on several matters. I merely suggested it wasn't necessary to boil laundry for 3 hours, and that perhaps the chickens would lay better if their coop was cleaned more than once a month," Victoria replied, lifting her chin. Alina couldn't help but smile. "You have spirit, Miss Hampton. Most men find that challenging. Then perhaps I need a man who isn't intimidated by a woman with opinions." Victoria tapped the letter against her palm. "This Mr. O'Rourke, has he rejected any previous matches?" "He's never had one. As I said, I've been reluctant to send anyone to such isolation." Victoria drew a deep breath. "Send me to him." "My dear, you don't understand what you're asking. His ranch is miles from the nearest neighbor. Winters are brutal. It's no place for a Boston-bred lady." "I am no longer a lady, Mrs. Hatcher. I am a woman in need of a future." Victoria squared her shoulders. "If Mr. O'Rourke is willing to accept me, I will go." Alina studied her for a long moment. "Very well, I'll send a telegram today, but Victoria." She reached out to clasp the younger woman's hand. "If you find yourself in an untenable situation, you send word. I'll find a way to bring you back." 3 days later, Victoria stood on the Sweetwater train platform, her carpetbag and trunk beside her. The morning air was crisp with early autumn, the sky an endless blue canvas stretched above the rugged landscape. She checked her pocket watch for the 3rd time, wondering if Francis O'Rourke had changed his mind. His reply to Alina's telegram had been characteristically brief. "Send her. We'll meet train Thursday." A cloud of dust on the horizon caught her attention. As it drew closer, she made out a wagon pulled by 2 sturdy horses. The man driving sat tall in the seat, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the morning sun. Victoria smoothed her navy traveling dress, suddenly conscious of her appearance after days of travel. She had chosen practicality over fashion for this journey, but now she wondered if she should have worn something more feminine. The wagon pulled up to the platform, and Francis O'Rourke stepped down. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. He was taller than she had imagined, with shoulders that strained against his simple cotton shirt. His face was tanned and weathered beneath a well-worn hat, with eyes the color of the Wyoming sky. A neatly trimmed beard covered his jaw, streaked with just a touch of gray despite him appearing to be in his early 30s. "Miss Hampton." His voice was deep, with the barest hint of an Irish accent. Victoria stepped forward, extending her gloved hand. "Mr. O'Rourke." "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." He hesitated before taking her hand briefly. "You're smaller than I expected." Victoria blinked at his bluntness. "I assure you, sir, my size has never impeded my ability to work." A flicker of something surprise perhaps crossed his face before his expression settled back into impassivity. "I meant no offense. The journey to the ranch is rough. I wasn't sure you'd manage it." "I have managed quite well so far, Mr. O'Rourke. I believe I can endure a wagon ride." He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded once and turned to her luggage. "This all you've got?" "Yes, I packed only what was necessary." He lifted her trunk with ease, placing it in the wagon bed before returning for her carpet bag. "We'll need to stop for supplies before heading out. Winter comes early in these parts." Victoria climbed onto the wagon seat without waiting for his assistance, gathering her skirts carefully. "I'm quite aware of the seasons, Mr. O'Rourke. We had them in Boston as well." His mouth twitched, almost forming a smile before he caught himself. "Not like Wyoming winters, Miss Hampton. Nothing like them at all." As they drove through Sweetwater's Main Street, Victoria took in the dusty frontier town with its wooden sidewalks and false-fronted buildings. Women in calico dresses and men in work clothes stopped to stare as they passed, clearly curious about Francis O'Rourke's companion. "I take it you don't come to town often," she observed, "when necessary." He guided the horses to a stop in front of a large general store. "Wait here, I'll be quick." Victoria bristled at the command. "I prefer to accompany you if you don't mind. I'd like to see what supplies are available." He frowned but didn't argue, coming around to help her down from the wagon. His hands were strong and calloused as they spanned her waist, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. Inside the store, the proprietor's eyes widened at the sight of them. Francis O'Rourke, twice in 1 month, must be some kind of record. His gaze shifted to Victoria. "And who might this lovely lady be?" Francis cleared his throat. "Miss Hampton, she's come to be my wife." The blunt introduction left Victoria momentarily speechless. The storekeeper recovered first, extending his hand. "Walter Johnson, Miss Hampton, welcome to Sweetwater. We don't often see new faces, especially ones as pretty as yours." Victoria shook his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson. It's a pleasure to meet you." While Francis gathered supplies, flour, coffee, bacon, ammunition, Victoria wandered the store, making mental notes of available goods. She selected a few items of her own: a sturdy cookbook, some paper and pencils, and a small bottle of rosewater. When they reached the counter, Francis eyed her selections but made no comment, simply adding them to his purchases. "You'll need more than that," Victoria said, eyeing the pile of supplies. "Especially if winters are as harsh as you claim." Francis glanced at her sharply. "I know what we need. Do you have dried fruits, preserves, extra lamp oil?" She turned to the storekeeper. "Do you carry medicinal supplies? Liniments, bandages, iodine?" Mr. Johnson blinked in surprise but began gathering the items. "Yes, madam. Got most of that in stock." Francis's jaw tightened, but he remained silent as Victoria directed the storekeeper to add various items to their order. When the total was tallied, he paid without comment, though she noticed the muscle working in his cheek. Back in the wagon, as they left town behind, he finally spoke. "I've survived 10 years on this ranch without your advice on supplies, Miss Hampton." "Surviving isn't the same as living well, Mr. O'Rourke," she replied evenly. "And if I'm to be your wife, I should have some say in household matters." "We're not married yet," he reminded her, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Victoria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "No, we're not. And if you've changed your mind, I would prefer you tell me now rather than after we've traveled 30 miles. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I haven't changed my mind, but you might once you see the ranch. I don't frighten easily, Mr. O'Rourke." "No," he agreed, studying her with those piercing blue eyes. "I don't believe you do." They rode in silence for some time, the landscape gradually changing from rolling prairie to more rugged terrain. Victoria watched as hawks circled overhead and distant herds of pronghorn antelope grazed on the hillsides. "It's beautiful," she said softly, almost to herself. Frances looked surprised. "Most find it desolate." "There's a certain wildness to it," she admitted, "but beauty nonetheless." She hesitated before asking, "Tell me about your ranch. What should I expect?" He seemed to consider his words carefully. "It's not what you're accustomed to, I'm sure. The house is small 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting area. There's a barn, corrals, and a bunkhouse for the hands, though I only keep 2 men year-round, more during spring roundup and branding. And your cattle, about 500 head of Hereford and Angus cross. Good stock. I've been building the herd for years." Victoria nodded, absorbing this information. "How far to the nearest neighbor?" 7 miles to the Colton's place, 15 to the next ranch after that. The isolation was even more extreme than she'd imagined. And the nearest town, Sweetwater's the closest for supplies. There's a smaller settlement called Willow Creek about 20 miles east, but it's not much more than a trading post and saloon. They stopped midday to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried beef. Victoria stretched her legs, walking a short distance to admire the view from a rocky outcropping. "Careful," Frances called. "Rattlesnakes like those rocks." She retreated quickly, returning to the wagon. "Are there many dangers I should be aware of?" Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. "Rattlesnakes, wolves, mountain lions, blizzards, flash floods, prairie fires. Wyoming doesn't lack for ways to kill the unwary." "How reassuring," she said dryly. This time, he did smile, a brief transformation that softened his features and created crinkles at the corners of his eyes. "You'll learn to read the land to see the signs. It keeps its promises, good and bad." They continued their journey through the afternoon, the wagon jolting over increasingly rough terrain. Victoria's back ached, but she refused to complain, keeping her posture straight despite the discomfort. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the land, Frances pointed to a distant valley cradled between 2 gentle slopes. "There, Willow Creek Ranch." Victoria leaned forward, eager for her first glimpse of her new home. The house was smaller than she'd expected, a sturdy log structure with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Several outbuildings clustered nearby, a barn, corrals, what must be the bunkhouse. A creek bordered by willows cut through the property, explaining the ranch's name. "It's compact," she managed, trying to hide her dismay at the modest size. Frances shot her a sideways glance. "You can still change your mind, Miss Hampton. I can take you back to Sweetwater tomorrow." "I have no intention of returning to Sweetwater, Mr. O'Rourke." She straightened her shoulders. "A house can be improved upon. I assume you built it yourself," he nodded. "With help from my hands. Added the 2nd bedroom when," he stopped abruptly. "When you were married before," Victoria finished quietly, his hands tightened on the reins. "Mrs. Hatcher told you." "Only that you had been married and your wife passed away. I'm sorry for your loss." He gave a curt nod but offered no further information as they approached the ranch. 2 men emerged from the bunkhouse as the wagon pulled into the yard, one older with a gray mustache, the other young and lanky. "Miss Hampton, this is Hank Miller, my foreman," Frances said, indicating the older man. "And Joe Blackwood, one of my hands." Victoria nodded politely to both men, noting their surprise. "Gentlemen, it's a pleasure to meet you." Hank recovered first, removing his hat. "Madam." "Welcome to Willow Creek." "The house ready?" Frances asked him. "Yes, sir, cleaned it top to bottom, just like you asked. Fires lit in the stove, too." "Good. Help unload these supplies, then. Miss Hampton needs to rest after the journey." Victoria opened her mouth to protest that she wasn't tired, then realized it would be more diplomatic to allow Frances this small courtesy. She followed him to the house, taking in every detail of her new surroundings. The interior was simple but clean, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall of the main room. Rough-hewn furniture, a table with 4 chairs, a sofa covered in worn leather, a rocking chair filled the space. A doorway led to what she assumed was the kitchen, and 2 closed doors presumably led to the bedrooms. "It's more comfortable than it looks," Frances said, watching her appraisal. It has potential, she replied diplomatically. May I see the rest? He showed her the kitchen with its cast-iron stove, hand pump at the sink, and sturdy pine cupboards. Then he led her to a small bedroom furnished with a narrow bed, chest of drawers, and washstand. This will be your room, he said. Mine's across the hall. Bathrooms out back. We've got an outhouse and a separate washhouse with a tub. Creek provides good water year-round. Victoria nodded, trying to hide her dismay at the prospect of outdoor facilities after a lifetime of indoor plumbing. Thank you, it's very practical. A flash of something perhaps hurt crossed his face before his expression became impassive again. I'll bring in your trunk. Supper in an hour. Left alone, Victoria sank onto the bed, finally allowing herself to acknowledge the enormity of what she had undertaken. The isolation, the primitive conditions, the taciturn man she had agreed to marry, all of it washed over her in a wave of doubt. No, she whispered firmly to herself. I will make this work. I must. She unpacked her few possessions, arranging them carefully to make the Spartan room more personal. When Frances knocked to announce supper, she had changed into a fresh dress and pinned up her hair. The kitchen smelled of coffee and fried potatoes. Frances stood at the stove, turning bacon in a cast-iron skillet. You cook? She asked, surprised. Had to learn, he replied without turning. Sit, it's nearly ready. Victoria took a seat at the small table, already set with mismatched plates and cups. Tomorrow I'll take over the cooking duties. What time do you usually have breakfast, Dawn? But you needn't. If I'm to be the woman of this house, Mr. O'Rourke, I intend to fulfill my responsibilities. She folded her hands in her lap. Unless you'd prefer I didn't. He served the simple meal: bacon, fried potatoes, and biscuits that looked suspiciously like they'd come from a tin before sitting across from her. Do as you please. I've managed on my own this long. They ate in uncomfortable silence, the only sounds the scrape of forks against plates and the occasional pop from the stove. How long have you lived here? Victoria finally asked, unable to bear the quiet any longer. Frances seemed relieved at the neutral topic. Built the place 12 years ago. Was working as a ranch hand before that, saved every penny to buy this land. It's a beautiful piece of property, she said sincerely. The creek looks like it never runs dry. It doesn't, fed from springs in the hills. He hesitated, then added, there's good soil near the creek too. Previous owner had a vegetable garden. Gone wild now, but the ground's still there. Victoria brightened. I'd love to restart the garden come spring. I've always enjoyed growing things, though I had limited space in Boston. Frances nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. What else did you do there, in Boston? The question surprised her. I helped manage my parents' household. My mother was often ill, so many of the duties fell to me. I also taught piano to supplement our income after my father's business failed. Piano, he repeated, as if the word were foreign. Not much call for that skill here. No, I suppose not. She looked around the kitchen, noting the absence of any musical instruments. Do you enjoy music, Mr. O'Rourke? He shrugged. Never gave it much thought. Hank plays the harmonica sometimes. That's about all the music we get. They lapsed into silence again, but it felt less strained than before. After dinner, Frances insisted on washing the dishes while Victoria explored the main room more thoroughly. She discovered a small bookshelf tucked in a corner, holding a dozen well-worn volumes, practical manuals on ranching and animal husbandry, a Bible, and surprisingly, several books of poetry. Wordsworth, she said, pulling one volume from the shelf. I wouldn't have guessed you enjoyed poetry. Frances glanced over from the kitchen doorway, a dish towel in his hands. My mother taught me to read with those books, said poetry was food for the soul. Victoria opened the book, noting the careful inscription on the flyleaf. To my dear son Francis, may you always find beauty in the world. With love, Mother. The date was 1855. She had beautiful handwriting, Victoria observed, carefully returning the book to its place. She was a schoolteacher before she married my father. He hung the towel to dry and moved into the main room, looking suddenly awkward in his own home. I should check on the stock before turning in. Make yourself comfortable. Victoria watched him go, noting the stiffness in his shoulders. The man was clearly unaccustomed to sharing his space or his life with anyone. She wondered, not for the first time, what had happened to his first wife and why he had waited so long to seek another. She was sitting in the rocking chair with one of the poetry books when he returned an hour later. The fire had burned low, casting the room in soft shadows, everything secure. She asked, closing the book. Yes, he stood just inside the door, hat in his hands. About our arrangement, Miss Hampton. Victoria tensed. Yes, we should discuss expectations, yours and mine. She nodded slowly. That seems sensible. I'm offering marriage, not just employment. A real marriage. His blue eyes held her steadily. But I won't rush you, we'll have a proper courtship first, get to know each other. Relief flooded through her. That's very considerate of you, Mr. O'Rourke. Francis, he corrected gently. If we're to be married, you should use my given name. Francis, she repeated, testing the name, and you should call me Victoria. He nodded, a hint of a smile touching his lips. Victoria, it suits you. Named for the Queen, she said with a small laugh. My mother had grand aspirations. Your mother chose well. He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with giving compliments. I'll ride into Willow Creek on Saturday. The trading post has a telegraph. I'll send word to Mrs. Hatcher that you've arrived safely. Thank you, I'm sure she's concerned. Victoria rose from the chair. I should retire, it's been a long day, of course. He stepped aside to let her pass. Sleep well, Victoria. Good night, Francis. In her small bedroom, Victoria changed into her nightgown and sat on the edge of the bed, brushing out her long brown hair. The events of the day swirled in her mind: the journey, the ranch, the quiet man who was to be her husband. Francis O'Rourke was not what she had expected. Behind his gruff exterior, she sensed a depth of character, a steadiness that was oddly reassuring. Whether they could build a life together remained to be seen, but for the first time since arriving in Wyoming, Victoria felt a flicker of hope. This wild, beautiful land might yet become home. The next morning, Victoria woke to the sound of movement in the kitchen. Pale light filtered through the simple muslin curtains. Dawn had barely broken. She dressed quickly in her plainest day dress, added a warm shawl against the morning chill, and twisted her hair into a simple knot at the nape of her neck. In the kitchen, Francis stood at the stove, stoking the fire to life. He turned at her entrance, surprise evident on his face. You're up early, he said, reaching for the coffee pot. I told you I would prepare breakfast. She moved to his side, gently taking the pot from his hands. Please allow me to begin my duties. He hesitated before relinquishing the kitchen to her. Coffee's important. The men expect it strong. Victoria smiled. I assure you I can manage coffee, Mr. O'Rourke. Francis, she corrected herself. Why don't you see to your morning chores while I prepare breakfast? When should I expect you back? About an hour. Hank and Joe will come in then too, if that's all right. Of course, I'll have everything ready. Once alone, Victoria surveyed the kitchen supplies with a critical eye. The pantry was woefully understocked, but she found eggs, bacon, flour, and lard enough for a proper breakfast. She set to work with practiced efficiency, soon having coffee percolating, biscuits in the oven, and bacon sizzling in the pan. By the time the men returned, stomping snow from their boots on the porch, the kitchen was warm and fragrant with the smell of fresh baking. Victoria had set the table with the mismatched dishes, adding a small jar of wild asters she'd found still blooming near the porch. Francis paused in the doorway, his expression shifting from surprise to something warmer as he took in the transformed kitchen. This is unexpected. Good morning, gentlemen, Victoria said, placing a platter of scrambled eggs on the table. Please sit, everything's ready. The men exchanged glances before taking their seats. Hank, the older foreman, removed his hat with a respectful nod. Madam, this is mighty kind of you. Young Joe's eyes widened at the spread before him. Yes, madam, thank you. Francis said nothing, but Victoria caught him watching her as she poured coffee and served the food. The men ate with appreciation, particularly enjoying the biscuits, which were light and fluffy compared to the store-bought variety they were accustomed to. These are the best biscuits I've had since my mama's, Hank declared, reaching for his third. Victoria smiled, pleased by the compliment. Thank you, Mr. Miller, an old family recipe. Just Hank, madam. We don't stand on formality out here. Francis finished his meal and pushed back from the table. Victoria, I need to ride the north pasture today. Won't be back until supper. I understand. I'll use the time to better acquaint myself with the house. She hesitated before adding, Is there anything specific you'd like for supper? A shadow crossed his face. Whatever you prepare will be fine, I'm not particular. After the men left, Victoria tackled the house with determined energy. She scrubbed floors, washed windows, and reorganized the kitchen to her liking. The house was sturdy and well-built, but clearly designed and maintained by a man with little interest in comfort or aesthetics. In the bedroom Frances had identified as his, she paused, uncertain whether to enter. Propriety suggested she should leave his private space untouched, but practicality argued that the room likely needed attention. After a moment's hesitation, she knocked softly before pushing open the door. The room was Spartan: a large bed with a simple quilt, a chest of drawers, and a washstand. A rifle stood in one corner, and a pair of spurs hung from a hook on the wall. The only personal touch was a small framed photograph on the dresser. Victoria approached it cautiously. The image showed a young woman with dark hair and a serious expression, dressed in the fashion of a decade earlier. Frances's first wife, she presumed. Beside it lay a woman's hairbrush, silver-backed and tarnished with age. She backed out of the room, leaving it untouched. Some ghosts were best left undisturbed. In the main room, she discovered a trunk pushed against the wall behind the sofa. Curiosity overcame her reservations, and she opened it to find household linens faded but of good quality and feminine items that must have belonged to Frances's wife. Victoria closed the trunk gently, making a mental note to ask Frances what he wished done with these things. By late afternoon, the house was transformed not by any dramatic change, but by the hundred small touches that make a house feel like a home. Victoria had polished the scarred table until it gleamed, arranged her few books alongside Frances's on the shelf, and placed a crocheted doily she'd brought from Boston beneath the lamp on the side table. She was preparing supper, a hearty stew with dumplings, when Frances returned. He stomped snow from his boots before entering, bringing with him the crisp scent of the outdoors. "Smells good," he said, hanging his coat and hat on a peg by the door. He paused, looking around the room with a slight frown. "You've been busy." Victoria couldn't tell if he was pleased or annoyed by the changes. "I hope you don't mind. I tried not to alter anything significant." He moved further into the room, his gaze taking in the subtle differences. "It's different good or different bad?" She asked, trying to keep her tone light despite her sudden anxiety. Frances ran a hand over the polished table surface. "Just different, I'm not used to." He gestured vaguely. "This, a woman's touch." "It's been a long time since you had a woman in your home," Victoria observed quietly. His expression shuddered. 5 years. Your wife, what was her name?" "Sarah." He said the name like it hurt his mouth. "The photograph in your room, she was very beautiful." Frances's head snapped up. "You went in my room." Victoria stood her ground despite his flare of anger. "I was cleaning." "I didn't disturb anything." He held her gaze for a long moment before the tension left his shoulders. "No, I suppose you wouldn't." He moved to the kitchen doorway. "Need help with supper?" The abrupt change of subject was clearly deliberate, and Victoria decided not to press. "You could set the table if you don't mind. It will be ready shortly." They worked in companionable silence, moving around each other in the small kitchen with surprising ease. When they sat down to eat, Frances seemed more relaxed than she'd yet seen him. "The stew is good," he said after several bites. "Been a while since I had dumplings." "Thank you. It's a simple recipe but filling." She hesitated before asking, "Will Hank and Joe join us for meals regularly?" "Breakfast, usually. They fend for themselves at midday." "Supper depends on the work. Sometimes they eat in the bunkhouse, sometimes here if we're planning the next day's tasks." Victoria nodded. "I'll plan accordingly. I noticed the garden plot you mentioned. It will need significant work before spring planting." "I can have the men clear it," Frances offered, "when the weather permits. I'd appreciate that." She took a sip of water. "Frances, I found a trunk with women's things. I assume they belong to Sarah." His hand tightened on his fork. "Yes. Would you prefer I leave them as they are, or—" "Do whatever you want with them," he said roughly. "They're no use to anyone now." Victoria recognized the pain beneath his brusque response. Perhaps we could store them properly in the attic. It seems disrespectful to discard them. Francis looked at her with an unreadable expression. There's no attic, but there's a shelf in my closet. You can put them there if it matters to you. Thank you. It does. She finished her stew, then asked, "How did you and Sarah meet?" For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, staring into his coffee cup, he said, "She was the daughter of a rancher 20 miles east of here. We met at a barn raising, married 6 months later. How long were you married?" 3 years. His voice was flat. Childbed fever took her, the baby too. Victoria's heart constricted. "I'm so sorry, Francis. What a terrible loss." He nodded once sharply, then stood and carried his dishes to the wash basin. "I've got accounts to look over. Don't wait up." Victoria watched him retreat to a small desk in the corner of the main room, effectively ending their conversation. She washed the dishes quietly, respecting his need for space, then retired to her room with one of his poetry books. Later, lying in bed, she reflected on what she'd learned. Francis O'Rourke was a man still haunted by loss, who had nevertheless found the courage to open his home, if not yet his heart, to another woman. Whether he could ever truly let go of the past remained to be seen. Victoria was determined to move forward, to build a life here on her own terms. But she was beginning to understand that winning Francis's trust, let alone his love, would require patience she wasn't entirely sure she possessed. The days fell into a rhythm as autumn deepened toward winter. Victoria took charge of the household duties with efficient grace, rising before dawn to prepare breakfast and spending her days cleaning, mending, and improving their living space. Francis and his men worked from sunrise to sunset, moving cattle to winter pastures, repairing equipment, and preparing the ranch for the coming cold. Their interactions remained cordial but distant. Francis seemed to appreciate Victoria's efforts, but maintained an emotional reserve that she found increasingly frustrating. Each time she attempted to learn more about him or share something of herself, he found reasons to end the conversation or leave the room. On Saturday, true to his word, Francis rode to Willow Creek to send a telegram to Mrs. Hatcher. He returned with supplies and a newspaper, which he handed to Victoria without comment. "Thank you," she said, genuinely pleased by the thoughtful gesture. Was Mrs. Hatcher relieved to hear I'm settled? Seemed to be. He removed his hat, hanging it on its customary peg, asked when the wedding would be. Victoria's heart skipped. "And what did you tell her?" "That we hadn't discussed it." He met her eyes directly. "Have you changed your mind?" "No," she said firmly. "Have you?" A faint smile touched his lips. "No." "Then perhaps we should discuss it." Victoria set the newspaper aside. "I understand there's a circuit preacher who visits Sweetwater monthly." Francis nodded. "Reverend Carson, due in 2 weeks' time." "Would that be suitable?" 2 weeks would give us time to become better acquainted." 2 weeks is fine." He hesitated, then added awkwardly, "I should get you a ring. There's a jeweler in Sweetwater." The unexpected gesture touched Victoria. "That's not necessary, Francis. It is to me." His tone brooked no argument. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the first real bite of winter in the air. After breakfast, Francis surprised Victoria by asking if she'd like to see more of the ranch. "I'd love to," she said, already reaching for her shawl. "Let me change into something more suitable." She emerged from her bedroom a few minutes later wearing her sturdiest skirt and boots, a warm jacket buttoned over her blouse. Francis waited on the porch, holding the reins of 2 horses, his own chestnut gelding and a smaller, dappled gray mare. "This is Daisy," he said, patting the mare's neck. "Gentlest horse on the place. She'll take good care of you." Victoria approached the horse cautiously. "I should warn you, I've had limited experience riding." "She's saddle broke for a lady rider," he assured her, indicating the side saddle. "Just hold the reins steady and she'll follow my horse." With Francis's assistance, Victoria mounted, arranging her skirts modestly over the side saddle. The position felt precarious, but Daisy stood patiently, seemingly unbothered by her inexperienced rider. Francis swung into his own saddle with practiced ease. "Ready?" she nodded, gripping the reins perhaps a bit too tightly. "Lead on." They rode at a leisurely pace, Francis pointing out features of the ranch as they went: the best grazing areas, the lined shack where hands stayed when working distant pastures, the natural springs that fed Willow Creek. Victoria gradually relaxed, finding her balance in the unfamiliar saddle. "It's magnificent," she said as they paused atop a small rise overlooking the valley. The ranch buildings looked tiny from this distance, nestled against the backdrop of rolling hills and distant mountains. "How much land do you own?" "About 5,000 acres, Francis replied. "Not large by Wyoming standards, but good land. Water rights secured, enough to build something worthwhile." Victoria heard the pride in his voice. "You've accomplished a great deal on your own." He glanced at her, seeming to search for insincerity in her compliment and finding none. "It's been my life's work. And now you're ready to share it," she observed quietly. Francis looked away, focusing on the distant horizon. "A man needs heirs, can't build a legacy without them." The stark practicality of his statement shouldn't have hurt, but Victoria felt a pang nonetheless. "Is that all you want from a wife, someone to bear your children?" He turned back to her, his expression softening slightly. "No, but it's a start. The rest, that comes with time, if it comes at all." "You don't believe in love?" she asked, unable to keep the challenge from her voice. "I believe it exists. I've known it." His gaze was steady. "But it's not a requirement for a successful marriage. Respect, honesty, shared purpose, those matter more in the long run." Victoria considered his words as they began their descent back toward the ranch. His view was pragmatic, perhaps even wise, but it left little room for the romantic notions she'd harbored despite her practical nature. "And what of passion?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Francis's hands tightened on his reins, but his expression remained impassive. "Passion fades, Victoria. It burns hot, then burns out. What remains is what matters." They rode in thoughtful silence until they reached a bend in the creek where several willows formed a natural canopy. Francis dismounted and helped Victoria down, his hands strong and sure at her waist. "This is my favorite spot on the ranch," he said, leading her toward a flat boulder near the water's edge. "Good place to think." Victoria sat beside him on the sun-warmed stone, watching the clear water tumble over smooth rocks. "It's peaceful. Francis seemed more relaxed here, away from the responsibilities of the ranch. He leaned back on his hands, face tilted toward the sun. "Found this place the day I bought the land. Knew then I'd made the right choice." "Did you always want to be a rancher?" Victoria asked, genuinely curious about the path that had led him here. "Since I was 12, he replied. "My father was a miner copper, mostly dangerous work. After he died, my mother and I moved to her sister's farm in Nebraska. First time I saw a working ranch was when I was hired to help with harvesting. Knew right then what I wanted." "And your mother, did she live to see you achieve your dream?" A shadow crossed his face. "No, consumption took her when I was 17. But she left me her savings enough for a stake in my future," she said. "The poetry books," Victoria murmured, "and her blessing." Francis picked up a small stone, turning it over in his calloused fingers. "What about you? What did you dream of becoming?" The question caught Victoria off guard. No one had ever asked about her ambitions before. "I wanted to be a teacher," she admitted. "I loved learning, sharing knowledge, but when my mother's health failed, I became her caretaker instead." "You resent that?" "No," she said thoughtfully. "I loved my mother. But I regret not having the chance to pursue my own path." Francis studied her face. "You could still teach. There are children on neighboring ranches, no school for 30 miles. Victoria's heart quickened at the suggestion. "You wouldn't mind, why would I? Seems a waste not to use your education." He skipped the stone across the water's surface. Something to consider for the future. They sat in companionable silence until the sun began its westward descent. On the ride back to the ranch, Victoria felt a subtle shift in their relationship, a tentative bridge spanning the careful distance they'd maintained. That evening, as Victoria prepared supper, Francis appeared in the kitchen doorway with an awkward formality that immediately caught her attention. "I have something for you," he said, holding out a small wooden box. Victoria wiped her hands on her apron and took the box, opening it with curious fingers. Inside, nestled on a scrap of faded velvet, lay a simple gold band set with a small but perfect sapphire. "Francis," she breathed, touching the ring with reverent fingers. "It's beautiful." It was my mother's, he said quietly. She gave it to me before she died, said to save it for the right woman. The significance of the gesture was not lost on Victoria. This was no hastily purchased token, but a family heirloom, a piece of his past freely given. Are you certain? She asked, searching his face. This should go to someone she stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence without revealing too much of her own growing feelings. Someone I respect, Francis finished for her. Someone I believe will be a true partner in building this ranch into something that will outlast us both. He took the ring from the box and held it out. If you'll have it. Victoria extended her left hand, watching as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Thank you, she said softly. I'll treasure it always. His fingers lingered on hers for a moment longer than necessary, the brief contact sending a surprising warmth through her veins. Then he stepped back, resuming his customary reserve. Supper smells good, he said, changing the subject with practiced ease. Need help with anything? Victoria allowed him the retreat, recognizing that he had already extended himself further than was comfortable. You could bring in more firewood, the temperature's dropping. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of preparation for both the wedding and the approaching winter. Victoria threw herself into making the house as comfortable as possible, using her limited resources with creative ingenuity. She repurposed Sarah's linens into curtains for the bare windows, fashioned a braided rug from scraps of worn clothing, and arranged dried wildflowers in tin cans painted with leftover whitewash. Francis observed these transformations with bemused tolerance, occasionally offering practical suggestions but never interfering. He spent long days with his men, ensuring the cattle were secure in sheltered pastures and the ranch buildings were prepared for winter storms. In the evenings, they established a new routine. After supper, instead of retreating to his desk, Francis would sit in his chair by the fire while Victoria occupied the rocker. Sometimes they read in companionable silence. Other times, Victoria would coax him into conversation about the day's work or his plans for the ranch's future. 3 days before the wedding, the first major snowstorm of the season descended upon Willow Creek Ranch. Victoria woke to find the world transformed into a white wonderland, snow piled against the windows and drifting across the yard. Will this delay the wedding? She asked anxiously as Francis came in from checking the stock, his beard and eyebrows frosted with ice crystals. He shook his head, stamping snow from his boots. Storms moving east, should clear by tomorrow. Reverend Carson's used to Wyoming, whether he'll make it to Sweetwater on schedule. And we'll be able to reach town, we'll make it, he assured her, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. Might take the sleigh instead of the wagon, but we'll get there. Victoria nodded, relieved. Despite her practical approach to their arrangement, she found herself increasingly eager to formalize their union. The sapphire ring on her finger felt right, as did her place in this home she'd begun to think of as her own. That evening, as they sat before the fire, Francis cleared his throat with uncharacteristic hesitancy. There's something we should discuss before the wedding. Victoria set aside her mending. Yes, sleeping arrangements. He stared into the fire, avoiding her gaze. I want you to know there's no expectation. We can maintain separate rooms as long as you wish. Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced herself to meet the subject with the same directness he had. That's very considerate of you, Francis, but I believe marriage should be a true union in all respects. He looked at her then, his blue eyes darkened with an emotion she couldn't quite name. You're certain? I am, she managed a small smile, though I confess to some nervousness. My mother's instruction on wifely duties was rather limited. A hint of answering humor softened his expression. We'll find our way together. The day before the wedding dawned clear and cold, the fresh snow sparkling in the winter sunlight. After breakfast, Francis hitched the horses to the sleigh, a practical conveyance with a box-like body and runners designed to glide over snow. We'll stay overnight at the hotel in Sweetwater, he explained as he helped Victoria into the sleigh, tucking warm buffalo robes around her legs. Weddings set for 10 tomorrow morning. Hank and Joe will follow later today. The journey to town was surprisingly pleasant despite the cold. The sleigh moved swiftly over the packed snow, bells jingling cheerfully from the harness. Victoria found herself relaxing against Francis's solid presence beside her, watching the winter landscape unfold around them. "It's beautiful," she said, admiring the way the sun caught the ice crystals clinging to pine branches. Like a fairy tale, Francis glanced at her, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Never thought of Wyoming as a fairy tale before." "Perhaps you haven't been looking through the right eyes," she suggested lightly. His gaze lingered on her face a moment longer than usual. "Perhaps not." They reached Sweetwater by mid-afternoon. The town was busier than on Victoria's previous visit, with Christmas only weeks away. Francis secured rooms at the modest hotel adjacent but separate accommodations that maintained propriety while acknowledging their impending marriage. "I have some errands to attend to," he said, after seeing her settled. "Will you be comfortable on your own for a few hours?" Victoria nodded. "Perfectly. I have a few purchases to make myself." They agreed to meet for supper at 6, giving Victoria time to refresh herself after the journey and change into something more suitable for dining in public. She chose her second-best dress, a deep green wool that complemented her eyes, and arranged her hair more elaborately than had been practical at the ranch. When she descended to the hotel's small dining room, she found Francis already waiting. He had shaved his beard and changed into a dark suit that transformed his appearance from rugged rancher to distinguished gentleman. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of her. "You look very nice," he said. Rising to hold her chair, Victoria smiled at the understated compliment. "As do you. I've never seen you in formal attire before. Don't often have cause to wear it." He settled across from her, seeming slightly uncomfortable in the fitted jacket. "Thought the occasion warranted the effort." The meal was simple but well-prepared: roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread. They ate in companionable silence, occasionally commenting on the other diners or the town's preparations for the holiday season. As they finished their coffee, Francis reached into his pocket and produced a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. "Something for you, for tomorrow." Surprised, Victoria unwrapped the package to find a delicate silver hairpin topped with a small pearl. "It's lovely, Francis, thank you," thought it might. "Hold your veil or some such." He looked embarrassed by his limited knowledge of feminine accessories. The shopkeeper suggested it. "It's perfect." She touched the pearl gently. "I'll wear it with pride." He nodded, seemingly relieved by her approval. "Tomorrow then, 10 o'clock at the church. I'll be there," she promised. They parted in the hotel lobby, Francis escorting her to her room before retiring to his own. Victoria prepared for bed with meticulous care, laying out her wedding dress, a simple ivory silk she'd brought from Boston, more practical than romantic but the best she owned. Sleep eluded her as she contemplated the step she would take in the morning. Marriage to Francis O'Rourke had begun as a practical solution to her circumstances, but somewhere in the weeks since her arrival at Willow Creek, it had become something more. Not love, perhaps not yet, but a genuine desire to build a life together, to be more than merely convenient to each other. Morning arrived with bright sunshine and a fresh dusting of snow. Victoria dressed with care, arranging her hair in a simple knot at the nape of her neck, secured with Francis's pearl pin. Her ivory dress was complemented by a matching jacket trimmed with satin ribbons, her one concession to bridal finery. At 9:45, a knock at her door revealed Hank Miller, looking uncomfortable in a clean shirt and string tie. "Mr. O'Rourke asked if I'd escort you to the church, madam," he said, twisting his hat in his hands. "Said it wasn't proper for him to see you beforehand." Victoria smiled at the unexpected adherence to tradition. "That's very thoughtful, Hank. I'd be honored by your escort." The small church on Sweetwater's Main Street was simply decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons for the approaching Christmas season. As Victoria entered on Hank's arm, she saw only a handful of people gathered in the pews. Joe, a few townspeople she recognized from her previous visit, and Mrs. Hatcher, whose presence was a welcome surprise. And at the altar, standing straight and tall beside the Reverend Carson, was Francis. He turned as she approached, and the expression that crossed his face sent a flutter through Victoria's heart. For just a moment, his careful reserve fell away, revealing something that looked remarkably like wonder. The ceremony was brief and traditional. They exchanged simple vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish words that felt both overwhelming and exactly right as Victoria spoke them. Francis's hands were steady as he placed a plain gold band beside her mother's sapphire ring, but she felt them tremble slightly when she slid a matching band onto his finger. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Carson declared with a broad smile. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. O'Rourke." Francis hesitated, then leaned forward to place a gentle kiss on Victoria's lips, their first intimate contact. The brief touch was surprisingly warm, sending a current of awareness through her body that lingered even after he drew away. Mrs. Hatcher hosted a small reception at the hotel, where a corner of the dining room had been reserved for the wedding party. She embraced Victoria warmly, whispering, "I knew you were right for each other the moment I received his reply to my telegram." "What did he say?" Victoria asked curiously. The older woman smiled. "When I mentioned you'd been returned by Mr. Sullivan for being too stubborn, Francis wrote back, 'Send her. A little fire is exactly what Willow Creek needs.'" Victoria glanced across the room to where Francis stood speaking with Hank and Joe. Had he really seen value in the very quality another man had rejected? The thought warmed her more than the champagne Mrs. Hatcher pressed into her hand. They left Sweetwater mid-afternoon, Francis explaining that he preferred to reach the ranch before dark. The journey home was quieter than their trip to town, both of them seemingly lost in thoughts of the step they had taken. As the sleigh crested the final hill overlooking Willow Creek Ranch, Francis drew the horses to a halt. The setting sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered valley, turning the simple log house and outbuildings into a picture-perfect homestead. "Welcome home, Mrs. O'Rourke," he said quietly. Victoria looked at the man beside her husband now in truth as well as name, and felt a surge of determination. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it with the same courage that had brought her west in the first place. "Thank you, Francis," she replied. "It's good to be home." He clicked to the horses, and they continued down the slope toward their shared future. That evening, after a simple supper prepared from the provisions they'd brought from town, Victoria faced the moment she'd both anticipated and dreaded. Standing in her small bedroom, she changed into her best nightgown, white cotton trimmed with eyelet lace, modest but the finest she owned, and brushed her hair until it fell in waves down her back. A soft knock at the door made her heart skip. "Victoria, may I come in?" She took a steadying breath. "Yes, Francis." He entered slowly, already changed into his own nightclothes, simple drawers, and a cotton undershirt that revealed arms corded with muscle from years of ranch work. His hair was damp, suggesting he'd bathed in the wash house despite the cold. "You're beautiful," he said simply, closing the door behind him. Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Thank you." Francis moved to stand before her, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap on his skin. "I meant what I said earlier, there's no rush, if you'd prefer to wait." She shook her head. "I wouldn't." Then, summoning her courage, she added, "But I would appreciate patience. This is new territory for me." Understanding softened his expression. "For me as well in many ways." He reached out to touch her cheek gently. "It's been a long time since I've been a husband." The vulnerability in his admission touched Victoria deeply. She turned her face into his palm, pressing a kiss to his calloused skin. "Then we'll learn together." What followed was a gentle exploration, tentative at first, then increasingly confident as they discovered each other. Francis proved a considerate lover, attentive to her responses and careful of her inexperience. Victoria surprised herself with the depth of her own passion once initial nervousness faded, finding joy in their physical connection that transcended mere duty. Afterward, lying in the circle of his arms, Victoria felt a contentment she hadn't anticipated. This was more than the practical arrangement she had agreed to. Something was growing between them, tender and fragile but undeniably real. "Francis," she murmured against his chest. "Are you awake?" "MMM." His hand stroked lazily through her hair. "I'm glad I came to Wyoming." Even if Mr. Sullivan did send me back, she felt rather than saw his smile in the darkness. Sullivan's a fool, always thought so. Victoria propped herself up on one elbow to see his face. You knew him, met him once at cattle auction. Man doesn't know the difference between good stock and mediocre. Frances tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His loss is my gain. The days following their wedding established a new rhythm to life at Willow Creek Ranch. Victoria took full ownership of her role as mistress of the house, while Frances included her more frequently in discussions about ranch operations. They shared the main bedroom, now Victoria's smaller room, repurposed as a sewing space and study. Winter settled in earnest, bringing howling blizzards that sometimes kept them housebound for days. During one such storm, Victoria discovered an unexpected talent in her taciturn husband. You're restless, Frances observed as she paced before the fireplace, having exhausted her usual indoor occupations. Come here, I'll teach you something. He retrieved a small wooden box from a shelf and opened it to reveal an assortment of carved wooden pieces. Chess, he explained, setting up the board on the table. My father taught me. Good way to pass winter evenings. Victoria sat across from him, eager for the distraction. I've seen it played but never learned the rules. With patience and clarity, Frances explained each piece's movement and the object of the game. Victoria proved a quick study, her strategic mind grasping the concepts readily. Though she lost their first match handily, by their third game she managed to present a reasonable challenge. You're a natural, Frances said with genuine admiration as she captured his knight with a well-planned maneuver. Victoria smiled, pleased by the compliment. I enjoy the strategy. It's like a puzzle. Life's like that sometimes, he observed, studying the board. Figuring out the right move when there's no clear path. Is that how you see our marriage? She asked, seizing the opening to discuss what had been on her mind. A strategic alliance, Frances looked up, his blue eyes serious. It started that way, perhaps, but it's becoming more, isn't it? The directness of his question caught her off guard. Yes, she admitted softly. For me it is, for me as well. He reached across the board to take her hand. I didn't expect that, nor did I. Victoria turned her hand to lace her fingers with his, but I'm glad of it. The quiet admission marked another step in their evolving relationship. Physical intimacy had come more easily than emotional openness, but gradually, Frances began sharing more of himself. He spoke of his parents, his early years working on other men's ranches, his dreams for Willow Creek. In turn, Victoria told him of her childhood in Boston, her love of books and music, her hopes for someday having children of her own. As Christmas approached, Victoria threw herself into preparations despite their isolation and limited resources. She baked cookies using precious sugar and molasses, fashioned simple decorations from pine cones and red ribbon, and even convinced Frances to help her find and cut a small pine tree to place in the corner of the main room. My mother always made Christmas special, no matter how little we had, she explained as they decorated the tree with paper stars and strings of dried berries. It's about creating traditions, memories that last. Frances watched her work with bemused affection. Sarah tried to do something similar our first Christmas. I wasn't very receptive then. It was the first time he'd voluntarily mentioned his late wife since their marriage. Victoria paused in her decorating, sensing the importance of the moment. Why not? She asked gently. He shrugged, seemingly absorbed in straightening a paper star. Thought it was foolishness, waste of time better spent on practical matters. He glanced at her, a hint of regret in his eyes. I was wrong. Victoria moved to his side, resting her hand on his arm. It's never too late to start new traditions. On Christmas morning, Victoria woke to find Frances already gone from their bed. Wrapping herself in a warm robe, she followed the scent of coffee to the kitchen, where she found him setting the table for breakfast. Merry Christmas, he said, looking up at her entrance. Merry Christmas, Frances. She moved to help him, then noticed a small package at her place at the table. What's this? Open it and see. He poured coffee into their cups, watching as she untied the simple string. Inside the brown paper wrapping, Victoria found a small leather-bound book. Opening it, she discovered blank pages of good quality paper. A journal, Frances explained, For your thoughts, plans for the garden, teaching ideas, whatever you wish." Tears pricked at Victoria's eyes. The gift was so perfectly thoughtful, so attuned to her nature. "It's wonderful, thank you." "There's an inscription," he said, gesturing to the front page. Victoria turned to it and read aloud, "To Victoria who brought light back to Willow Creek. With love, Francis." She looked up at him, heart full. "With love," he nodded, a vulnerability in his expression she'd rarely seen. "Yes." Setting the journal carefully aside, Victoria went to the small trunk where she'd hidden her own gift. "I have something for you as well." Francis unwrapped the package to reveal a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool that matched his eyes. "You made this, in the evenings, while you were doing the accounts." She'd worked on it secretly for weeks, using yarn purchased in Sweetwater and stored in her sewing room. "I noticed your old one was rather worn." He ran his fingers over the neat stitches. "No one's made me anything since my mother." His voice was gruff with emotion. "Thank you, Victoria. Try it on," she urged. Francis wrapped the scarf around his neck, the blue bringing out the color of his eyes just as she'd hoped. "How does it look?" "Perfect," she said softly. Then, gathering her courage, she added, "I love you, Francis." It was the first time either of them had spoken the words directly. For a moment, he looked startled, almost alarmed. Then his expression softened into something so tender it made her heart ache. "Victoria," he said, crossing the space between them in 2 strides and pulling her into his arms. "I never thought I'd feel this way again. Wasn't sure I could." She wrapped her arms around his waist, holding him close. "You don't have to say it back, I just wanted you to know." "But I do," he murmured against her hair. "I do love you, have for weeks now, just wasn't sure I had the right." Victoria leaned back to look up at him. "The right." "After Sarah, I felt disloyal even considering loving someone else." His hands framed her face gently. "But you've shown me there's room in a heart for both grief and new joy." Their kiss was different from any they'd shared before, deeper, more certain, filled with the knowledge of love acknowledged and returned. When they finally parted, Victoria rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "This is the best Christmas I can remember," she said softly. Francis pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "First of many, I hope." As winter slowly yielded to spring, life at Willow Creek Ranch became increasingly busy. The first calves of the season arrived in late March, keeping Francis and his men working from dawn until well after dusk. Victoria divided her time between household duties and preparations for the garden, eager to put her plans into action as soon as the ground thawed. One evening in early April, Francis returned from checking the north pasture to find Victoria sitting at the table, surrounded by papers covered in neat handwriting. "What's all this?" he asked, hanging his hat on its peg. Victoria looked up with bright eyes. "Lesson plans." "Mrs. Johnson from the Colton Ranch visited today while you were out. She has 3 children of school age and the Petersons have 2. She asked if I might consider teaching them a few days each week once the weather improves." Francis smiled at her enthusiasm. "And you agreed, I take it." "If you have no objection, they could come here in the afternoons. I thought we might clear space in the storage room off the kitchen. It has good light from that south window." "No objection at all." He moved behind her chair, resting his hands on her shoulders. "But you'll need proper equipment. Desks, a blackboard, books." Mrs. Johnson said her husband could build simple desks. For the rest, Victoria hesitated. "I was hoping we might order some supplies from the catalog when we next go to town." "Of course." Francis squeezed her shoulders gently. "Whatever you need." Victoria reached up to cover his hand with hers. "Thank you. It means a great deal to me to use my education this way." "You were meant to teach," he said simply. "I've seen how you come alive explaining things, whether it's to Joe about baking bread or to me about the different varieties of beans you want to plant." She laughed. "Am I very tedious about the beans?" "Never tedious." He bent to press a kiss to the top of her head. "Just thorough." As May approached, bringing warmer weather and longer days, Victoria noticed subtle changes in her body, tenderness in her breasts, unexpected fatigue in the afternoons, a peculiar aversion to the smell of coffee that had never bothered her before. At first, she dismissed these symptoms as the result of increased activity as spring work intensified. But when her monthly cycle failed to appear for the second time, she could no longer ignore the likely explanation. She waited until a quiet evening when they were alone, Hank and Joe having ridden to a neighboring ranch to help with a difficult calving. Francis sat in his usual chair, reading a ranching journal while Victoria mended one of his shirts. "Francis," she said, setting aside her sewing. "I believe I'm with child." His head snapped up, the journal forgotten in his lap. "You're certain?" "As certain as I can be without a doctor's confirmation." She met his gaze steadily. "The signs are all there." For a moment he sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. Then he rose and crossed to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. "Victoria," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I never thought, after Sarah, understanding dawned. His first wife had died in childbirth, along with their baby. Of course he would have fears. This will be different," she said with more confidence than she felt. "I'm strong and healthy, and when the time comes, we'll make sure there's a doctor present." Francis pressed his forehead against their joined hands. "I can't lose you," he whispered. "Not now that I've found you." Victoria freed one hand to stroke his hair. "You won't lose me, my love. We'll face this together like everything else." He looked up, his blue eyes suspiciously bright. When will the baby come?" "November, I think, before Thanksgiving." A slow smile spread across his face. "A child of our own." He placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "Hello, little one. Your mother and father are waiting to meet you." The tender gesture brought tears to Victoria's eyes. This man, who had seemed so remote when they first met, now spoke to their unborn child with such open affection. It was a transformation she could scarcely have imagined 6 months earlier. News of Victoria's pregnancy spread quickly among their small circle. Mrs. Hatcher sent a package of fine baby linens from Sweetwater, while Hank surprised them with a beautifully carved cradle he'd been working on in secret since Christmas. "Been saving this wood for something special," he explained gruffly when Victoria embraced him with tearful thanks. "Can't think of anything more special than the first O'Rourke born at Willow Creek." As her body changed with the advancing pregnancy, Victoria found herself treasuring quiet moments with Francis more than ever. Often, they would sit on the porch in the evening, watching the sunset paint the hills in gold and crimson while Francis's hand rested protectively over the growing swell of her abdomen. "I've been thinking about names," she said one such evening in late August. "What do you think of Elizabeth for a girl after your mother, or James for a boy after my father?" Francis considered. "Elizabeth O'Rourke has a fine sound to it, James too, but what about a second name? My people usually give children too." "Elizabeth Victoria," she suggested, "or James Francis." "Perfect." He smiled, his hand moving to catch the baby's kick. "Strong names for a strong child." As autumn painted the hills in russet and gold, Victoria completed preparations for the baby's arrival. The small second bedroom was transformed into a nursery, furnished with Hank's cradle, a rocking chair Francis had purchased on a trip to Sweetwater, and a chest of drawers painted white by Victoria herself. Dr. Patterson from Sweetwater agreed to stay at the ranch for the week surrounding Victoria's expected delivery date, an arrangement that relieved Francis's anxiety considerably. The doctor arrived in early November, bringing with him the latest medical texts on childbirth and a reassuring confidence that put everyone at ease. "You're in excellent health, Mrs. O'Rourke," he declared after examining Victoria. "Strong as a mountain pony and twice as determined, I'd wager. This baby will come into the world just fine." 2 days later, as the first snow of winter dusted the hills around Willow Creek, Victoria's labor began. Francis paced the main room while Dr. Patterson and Mrs. Johnson, who had come to assist, attended Victoria in their bedroom. The hours stretched endlessly, marked only by Victoria's increasingly frequent cries and the doctor's calm instructions. As dusk fell, Hank brought Francis a cup of coffee and stood beside him at the window. "She's strong, boss," the foreman said quietly. "Strongest woman I ever met, except maybe your mother." Francis nodded, unable to speak past the knot of fear in his throat. The memory of another childbirth, another bedroom, another woman's final cries haunted him despite his faith in Victoria's strength. When a new sound pierced the evening quiet, the unmistakable wail of a newborn Francis froze, his coffee cup slipping from nerveless fingers to shatter on the floor. The bedroom door opened, and Dr. Patterson emerged, his face creased in a broad smile. "Congratulations, Mr. O'Rourke. You have a daughter, a perfect little girl with a fine set of lungs." "Victoria," Francis managed, his voice barely audible, tired but well, no complications whatsoever. The doctor clapped him on the shoulder. "You can go in now, they're waiting for you." On legs that threatened to buckle beneath him, Francis entered the bedroom. Victoria lay propped against pillows, her face pale but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up as he approached, her smile brighter than he'd ever seen it. "Francis," she said softly. "Come meet your daughter." He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, afraid to disturb either of them. Victoria turned back the blanket to reveal a tiny face, eyes screwed shut, wisps of dark hair plastered to a perfectly formed head. "She's beautiful," he whispered, reaching out a tentative finger to touch the baby's cheek. "Just like her mother." "Elizabeth Victoria O'Rourke," Victoria pronounced. 7 pounds exactly, according to Dr. Patterson, and very impatient to arrive. Francis felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep inside him, a sound of pure joy he'd thought never to experience again. "Impatient and stubborn, I'll wager. Like someone else I know." Victoria's eyes danced with amusement. "A little fire is exactly what Willow Creek needs, isn't that what you said?" Wisest words I ever spoke. He leaned forward to press a kiss to her forehead, then another to his daughter's. "Thank you, Victoria, for everything." "No," she said, reaching up to touch his cheek. "Thank you for seeing value in what others called stubbornness. For giving me a home, a purpose, a love I never thought to find." As the first winter stars appeared in the Wyoming sky, the small family huddled together in the warmth of their bedroom, bound by love that had grown from the most practical of beginnings into something deeper and more enduring than either could have imagined. In the years that followed, Willow Creek Ranch flourished under their joint stewardship. The cattle herd grew, as did their family. Elizabeth was joined by a brother, James, 2 years later, and eventually by another sister, Margaret. Victoria's small school expanded to include children from 5 neighboring ranches, necessitating the construction of a proper schoolhouse that doubled as a community gathering place. Her garden became famous throughout the county, producing vegetables that won ribbons at the territorial fair and providing seeds for other settlers struggling to adapt to Wyoming's challenging climate. Francis, no longer the solitary wolf of Willow Creek, became a respected leader in the ranching community, known for his fair dealings and innovative methods. But those who knew him best understood that his greatest pride lay not in his professional accomplishments, but in the family he and Victoria had built together. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard that had grown to include fruit trees and flower beds Victoria had painstakingly established, Francis took his wife's hand in his. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Coming west?" "Marrying a man you barely knew," Victoria smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Not for a single moment. Everything that brought me here, even being sent back by Mr. Sullivan, was a step on the path to where I was meant to be." With a stubborn rancher who didn't know what he needed until you arrived to tell him, Francis's voice held the gentle teasing that had become familiar over their years together. "Exactly." She turned to kiss him, the gesture as natural as breathing after a decade of shared life. "My mother used to say that some matches are made in heaven, but the best ones are forged in the challenges of earth." Francis nodded, watching as Elizabeth, now 9 and the image of her mother, helped 5-year-old Margaret pick wildflowers while 7-year-old James practiced roping a fence post under Hank's patient guidance. "Your mother was a wise woman," he said, "almost as wise as her daughter." As the sun set over Willow Creek Ranch, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors that had captivated Victoria on her first ride with Francis so many years before, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a reluctant mail-order bride, sent back for being too stubborn, to the beloved wife of a man who had recognized the value of her spirit, It was a story she would never tire of telling their grandchildren in the years to come. For now, though, she was content to sit beside the man whose love had given her the greatest gift of all. Not just a home or a family, but the freedom to be herself, stubborn nature and all.